Those have any comments on minutes?
Small comment, my name's spelled wrong.
Okay.
Well, that is a big
T-H-I-B-E-D-E-D-U. T-H-I-B-E-D-E-A-U, not B-O.
Any other comments? Minutes? All right, public comment period. Ooh, full house tonight. I am going to do a little housekeeping items. So please, again, just a reminder, Isabel sends a meeting information out there. If we could just respond, whether if you can't make it, we'd appreciate some notice so we know if we have quorums and such. Next up, again, after the last meeting, I want to reiterate that we need to be focused in our meetings. I really would prefer not to sidetrack. We had a couple issues about planning board items and I guess critiquing planning board. That's not what we're here to do as a committee. So we just need to stay focused, and I'd appreciate comments about ongoing projects. Those kinds of things are not necessarily appropriate in this venue. So I will try to keep a better handle on that moving forward.
I wish sorry, I missed it. That would have been
missed it.
Oh, it was me, Judd. Don't worry.
Okay.
Yeah. So did you mentioned the legal side of that, the regulatory side?
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to add with the regulatory part of that, in general, just because we have a bunch of planning board members present here, they're not really supposed to hear about projects until they get in front of them as well, just from a like quasi-judicial board standpoint. So yeah, I would just reiterate what you had already provided, that, talking broadly about issues, totally fine. When it gets into more specific projects when it might become a issue with ex parte communication and some of their quasi-judicial stuff. There are, I think, 4 of them on this committee, not to throw them under the bus, but.
Thank you. Thank you. Public comment. We don't have anybody. I don't know if Mitch is monitoring.
I can do it.
Yeah.
And there's nobody online.
All right, nobody online. We're moving on then. New business tonight. Isabel sent you all a packet of information, some pretty cool stuff about our town. Tonight, just a reminder, we're going over historic and cultural information, a little bit of fiscal stuff, and then existing land use chapter. So Isabel, I think you again have prepared a slideshow or summary.
Yeah, I want to start with historic and cultural context. I did invite someone from the Historical Society. Unfortunately, they had to cancel this afternoon. So hopefully I can answer any questions that you might have. Is there anyone else potentially involved with the Historical Society present? Okay. I was seeing some familiar names on their minutes, so just curious. But I can answer any questions that you have about sort of the historical development patterns and anything mentioned here, and then can follow up with him if needed, if there are more specific questions about their work. So in general, I'm planning to go through sort of what I did last time, just highlighting the issues and opportunities and presenting data in that way. At the end of each sort of chapter, I did put in a slide for questions and comments that you might have, so we can kind of talk about any questions that you have after I go through some issues. Okay, so with regards to the historic and cultural context, this is really focused on historic and archaeological resources. And a lot of the data here is coming from the State Historic Preservation Office. It is required, this map that you're seeing on the presentation is a required map to be included by the state. Interestingly, I noticed that although they provided it to us, it is dated March 2012, which was even before your last comp plan. And so I was just curious about that and reached back out. They noted that the data available on this map is their most recent data around prehistoric resources, that the data provided is actually primarily based on surveys that were conducted as part of hydroelectric relicensing requirements along the Penobscot River. So it's really only happened where it was required by state law. So some of the banks of the Penobscot River at the southern edge of town have not had a professional survey. And so this is really important just because, as you probably noted throughout the chapter, the planning board is relying on this data and data from the State Historic Preservation Office / Maine Historic Preservation Commission to understand the extent of historic or archaeological resources that might be impacted. So when there isn't necessarily data available, obviously we don't know what we don't know in terms of resources that might be available or archaeological information that we might be able to dig up. So kind of to that end, again, there have also been no professional surveys for historic, which they consider to be post-European settlement resources. And just highlighting again that survey is really vital to the town, since we rely on those to determine whether applications for development have to obtain comment from the State Historic Preservation Office to be considered by either the planning board or the code enforcement officer in their review. I do want to note, and they wanted me to stress this as well, that grants from the state are available for this type of work. So if the town was interested in pursuing some sort of like major archaeological survey or any other sort of historic or archaeological work, there are grants available.
Do they require a significant match, or they?
I have a little bit more information on my next slide, but it's typically anywhere from a 20% to a 40% match.
Question about it. I didn't understand about this in the map, in the southern part of town along the river, where say they're known archaeological sites. But you're also saying that there's not been a survey done. So how do we know, how did those known sites get identified?
I think there's some more information in the chapter.
Yeah, I remember reading that. It said 7 were identified, and then I wondered, I had to look at the blue and green squares. But
yeah, there's 7. There's 7 known.
That was from previous work.
7 known, mostly clustered around the banks of the Penobscot.
Where those 7 are on the southern shore of the southern part of town.
Well, we know there was like a historic rock got moved to the Old Town Library. That was a long time.
So unfortunately, the issue with the prehistoric sites, I'll just be sort of upfront about my frustration with the state. They give very little information about what it is that they found there, or how or why they found it, because they're trying to prevent disturbance. Yeah, and that's also why they do like a ½ kilometer square. So I'm frankly not sure what the resources are or how they were found.
It would have been something that they learned about without somebody doing this. Most
likely, like, you know, the other thing you're supposed to do if you are a developer, you know, digging a foundation or whatever, you are supposed to call the state if you run into archaeological resources. So it could have been something from that as well.
I guess I just have a general question: is how historic settlements were determined? Like there are parts of town that were listed as historic settlements, and then there's other parts of town where that certainly had people living in them in the 1800s and before that were not listed. That's how that came to be.
So in the document itself with the historic settlement patterns, I mostly was using the information that is readily available from either the state or from the National Register of Historic Places. So you'll see like Main Street, obviously we have a ton of information there. We have a ton of information there because they are National Register Historic Sites. And then downtown, I got that information from a book that's cited here, but it's not a National Register district or doesn't have a ton of information. So it tends to be less there. And similar for the Webster neighborhood, like that's not a historic, it's not a ton of information because it's not on the National Register. So it hasn't gone through any sort of rigorous review. So it was only the sort of limited information that's been provided. But I think to your point, if there's another neighborhood that I'm unaware of, this might be where I need to kind of rely on you. So if you're interested in another neighborhood being highlighted, I can do that to some extent with just data that's currently available.
Limited knowledge, like I live down on Broadway in the tough end, and I know that in the 1800s and the early 1900s, it was the working part of town, you know, and it was, you know, so, you know, it's called Broadway. So now there's 5 houses on it, but, you know, I think to that extent, that whole part of town down past the library has had population in it for a long time. So
the other thing I want to add here is this section around historic settlement patterns is specifically to answer a question from the state around, I think they worded as what historical developments are still sort of around and still noticeable. So, you know, obviously Main Street is very noticeable as you're driving in this way, even downtown to a lesser extent. So I think in terms of highlighting it here, it was really to answer their question. But if, you know, you wanted me to highlight something further and just note, you know, not necessarily historical development patterns still being evident, but that this was a historic place might be worthy of further conversation.
I doubt anything down there is preserved anyways, but like the old train stations down there, it's been converted into apartments.
Kind of going off of that, so there was a lot of conversation, well, there was some conversation in the 2014 plan about the Main Street overlay. And when you're coming into town, like after turning from Kelly Road, obviously you really start to get like a different feeling as you're driving down this or walking down this, that this is sort of a historic area. So the town recognized that in the 2014 plan, and then they did a pretty intensive study in 2016 around what additional properties outside of the National Register Historic District might be worthy of further incentives. And then in 2017, they adopted incentives that were meant to protect and preserve the Main Street overlay. And that was sort of a additional round of standards that allowed office uses to be located within the historic properties along Main Street. Unfortunately, they're not necessarily having the desired impact there. And I do want to note that many properties within the Main Street office overlay are not necessarily included in the boundaries of the National Register Historic District, which is a much smaller and tighter area. So they're not subject to any review for changes unless they're using that optional overlay incentive.
Elaborate on, for everybody's benefit, on what an overlay is.
Yeah, so in Orono, we have a couple of different kinds of overlays. We have shoreland zoning, which essentially adds additional standards meant to protect shoreland areas from erosion or environmental issues. Then we have, and those are requirements. And then we have things like the aquifer protection overlay, again, a requirement to protect the town's aquifers. And then sort of on the other hand, but works similarly, we have the Main Street overlay, which is an incentive-based overlay. So the standards are not requirements. They are standards that you can opt into if you're interested in pursuing certain kinds of things with your property. So in this case, they had asked for, they had allowed for office uses to be included in these properties, which is not otherwise allowed in the underlying zoning district, but which is allowed if you meet certain regulations that you opt into.
That makes sense.
Could you say something about what is our understanding of what the desired impact was supposed to be?
So I think, and as I understand it, just going back through the memos from that time, the desired impact was really to protect them from sort of, I don't know how to put this lightly, like some of the deterioration that we have been noticing on some of the properties. And it was intended I think the thought process was that if you were allowed to have an office unit in there, it might make you additional money or revenue so that you could fix up the building. I don't know, you know, how many, there's not been that many properties that have taken advantage of that. And therefore not many properties are bound to the standards, the optional overlay standards.
We were trying to create flexibility so that homeowners, if they wanted that option, it might be a way to keep those buildings up.
In the extreme case, so that they wouldn't tear down a historical structure to build something else.
Yeah.
Here's an incentive for you to allow it to be more fiscally possible for you to stay there.
Attracting businesses too, so it was an overall theme, like with our home occupations and home businesses, that kind of thing, Jeff.
Yeah. And then to take advantage of those incentives, have the office there, you had to adhere to a whole set of historical architectural requirements for that particular building.
And this is just the outside, and
Yeah,
the inside of the
outside.
building anything can be done, but the outside must remain the same.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah. And kind of to that point, it's sort of a common misconception that simply being listed on the National Register of Historic Places means that a property is protected from demolition or change. So for example, a lot of the properties on this stretch of road are in that National Register Historic District. They can be demolished, they can be changed, unless they're using tax credits for some reason to do some sort of like apartment building or business use. So I think allowing some sort of business would have also allowed them to opt into historic tax credits, which are not available to residential property owners, at least at this point in Maine. To that point, local regulation is often considered one of the most important and frankly, the most best way to guarantee historically sensitive changes to properties, if that's the aim. And like I already mentioned, grant funding is available through the Maine Historic Preservation Commission, the State Historic Preservation Office. Interestingly, despite Orono's number of documented historic resources and the desire articulated back in the 2014 plan to steward them, it has not necessarily leveraged outside assistance with preservation. A lot of communities of comparable size are using the state's certified local government program, which is sponsored by the State Historic Preservation Office. And through that program, grant funding is consistently available on an annual basis. It does require the town, though, to opt into regulations that would protect historic resources on a local level. There are grants available outside of that program. They are just not funded on the same annual basis as this one. And to get back to your question, CLG grants are typically between a 20 and a 40% match. So they're sort of a lower match for those type of projects.
What's the pool of money max?
So I've gotten anywhere from 20,000 to 120,000. I think the maximum is in that $120,000 range. But I mean, in terms of architectural survey or archaeological survey, you know, those are typically running towns $20,000 to $30,000, depending on the area you're trying to survey. So not a huge lift in terms of a match. And then this was also highlighted back in the 2014 plan, but I wanted to expand on it a little bit. So historic resources are important parts of the community's identity and its brand, but they're not necessarily being utilized as economic assets right now. They're not really publicized and potentially are underused. There are more opportunities to weave them into the visitor, cultural, and recreational experiences of the town. And many municipalities are designing walking tours, or you might have seen things like museum in the streets tours to showcase their community's past and encourage things like heritage tourism, like people traveling to a place to experience the place that authentically represents the stories and people of the community.
Are there tours of some of the residences, like the chases? If I recall, there have been historic tours with some of the buildings along Main Street. Do you recall that, Joe?
Yeah, well, there has been some, and there was a big effort At the tail end of this whole incentives for the historical and the overlay and all that, at the end of that, we were supposed to have a big architectural tour of the town, visiting all the sites. We had an architect come in and he surveyed all the buildings and described all the styles, all the stuff. And we were gonna have a big tour program and then COVID hit.
Okay.
All died. It's never been brought back up again.
Yeah, because there's quite a diverse type of architectural styles. I remember Evan gave a presentation in our last comp plan about all the different types of buildings along Main Street. We have a lot of different styles.
If anybody's interested, that architect's report with all the pictures and description, I think it's available. The town has it. You can ask for it.
I think I linked it in here, or at
Okay,
least
okay.
gave you the Google search to get you there.
And a quick note that this past Sunday, there was a walking tour on Webster side led by Bob Seymour.
Oh, great.
So there's a 2-hour walking tour of the historic history of that neighborhood. You can see them walking past your house.
I was rolling back into town as people were walking back from the tour.
It's at 2 to 4 p.m.
There we go. I'll get the next one, I guess. Yeah.
It seems like there was some event for a year or two that houses were opened up, and I can remember Dave Chase
Yeah.
dressed up as the former owner of or the original owner of the house. And
He does that all the time.
That's all.
Yeah, so I think in terms of like, when you're thinking about what the town might be able to do, one of those, like, we call it Museum in the Streets. I've been a part of designing those tours before, but it's the boards in front of properties that kind of allow you to read about what's going on inside those properties historically. And yeah, it has a map and a phone app that you can walk around with, so.
Are the owners of the homes wanting that?
Well, that's the issue. A lot
Yeah,
of
no,
times, is
exactly.
the owners, they don't want a sign in front of their house. Tells you when it was built.
I was just wondering if, we'd be pushing something.
We're here. Yeah.
Too bad, you don't want it?
But technologically, you could have
Yeah.
tour on your phone.
You wouldn't need a
It
sign.
could give you all that information.
Eric, can you describe what a Bob did? I'm curious on that, just for.
My mom attended, I did not.
Yeah.
But they came to our house because our house used to be a store and beauty salon.
Yeah.
Before it was our house. They walked around Webster. I think Webster has the old firehouse, has a schoolhouse that burned down, has the first building that was built on Webster Island. It's the one at Webster Park. There's the whole history of Webster Park and how it was granted as a, I don't know, land trust or public space to be a park for the community. And then a lot of the homes in Webster neighborhood are quite old. And so the history was of the buildings and past residents and the notoriety of those different people that live there and the different businesses that were in a lot of homes that are now privately lived in by residents. So everything was it was very informal in the sense that there was Bob going around talking about his history growing up here and his parents growing up here and how he remembered working in these places and being a young kid. And I think there was like 25 people, even though it was like 92 degrees and it was quite uncomfortable outside, but and so it was well attended. And what I have gathered from our neighbors is that people didn't mind it one bit. That there was a crowd walking in front of different homes and talking about it. No one went in. It was an outdoor walking tour.
Yeah, we didn't notice anything missing from my house when I got back. So
No.
that's good. Good.
Any other questions or comments on historic and cultural context? So moving on to fiscal health, I don't know if I got too into the weeds here or if this is interesting to anyone else. I'm kind of a public finance nerd. What I wanted to highlight specifically here is around the importance of analyzing the town's budget and how it's spending expending money. So in general, I wanted to note that there is a lot of information from the past 5 years, which the state specifically requires about how the budget has changed. In general, a municipality's budget includes its plans for spending and how it anticipates funding those plans. So revenues versus expenditure, or vice versa, expenditures versus revenues. And then these plans are based on the government-wide departmental programming and community needs and goals. So we can think of it by putting money aside or behind promises and commitments, or choosing not to do so. The adopted budgets end up revealing the priorities of the municipality. And unfortunately, there is never enough money to do everything that we want to do. So what I had talked about in terms of opportunities here was with regard to strategic growth and economic development. So the town has to continue to pursue new or enhanced revenue sources in order to sustain its fiscal health and keep being able to provide all the things that they need to provide. I had noted that strategic growth and economic development can end up bolstering the tax base without increasing the tax rate, which would be one of the ways that could enhance revenue, but it might not be the most palatable way. So there have been a variety of studies that have shown that targeted infill development, so sort of smart growth, characterized by smaller scale individual projects of new building or rehabilitation of existing structures, or remodeling existing structures, or adding additions to existing structures within already developed areas, ends up saving an average of 10% on the ongoing delivery of services. Obviously requires far less upfront infrastructure costs from the development side, and can end up generating up to 10 times more tax revenue per acre than conventional sort of sprawl or suburban development. We are already blessed with a wonderful downtown area. And as we'll get into a little bit more in the existing land use section, there might be some opportunity for some strategic growth or economic development within that area, if that's what the community is interested in.
Is it infill means filling in empty spaces, or does infill mean filling in low areas?
So infill literally means like filling in empty lots, right, or adding on or sort of enhancing existing lots. Not like bringing in fill to the river or anything. Yeah.
So one of the example we used last time was the proposed development up the way. It was going to connect between, Black Bear Heights. Yes.
That one.
Yeah, Black Bear Heights was going to connect dead ends, create a more utility looping, that kind of stuff. There's all kinds of advantages of it. But yeah, with a trail to the school, a very, very nice concept, close to services. So it's just a really nicely thought out project.
And I would even argue that you could think of it even smaller, like converting a single family home to a duplex or adding an ADU would also be considered infill development. Or even doing, like the rehab of the Byron factory would also be considered sort of the infill development. It's a heavier use of the previously vacant site for things like housing. And then as another opportunity, regional partnerships should probably be continued to be explored. So many municipalities across the state have begun to partner with neighboring communities to share in the cost of programming. So things like joint delivery of recreation programs, but also things like capital projects and even staffing. So there are many communities that are sharing in the costs of police departments, of town planners, of any number of staff people that can be split between communities as sort of a full-time job with benefits to attract the kind of talent that you're looking for, but also shared between two different towns. And then we also already do this. So I wanted to highlight, obviously in terms of regional solutions to service delivery, the community connector bus system, which is cost shared with the city of Bangor, is something we do currently. And that's also going to be important to sustain our fiscal health in the future.
Jeff, when you were on council, discussions that you folks might have had at the time about regional partnerships, do you have any story? Well, I know things were talked about, but I'm just curious.
Controversy surrounded the consolidation of the school district. That was the biggest conversation. And there was opponents for sharing a high school with Old Town, and the university had offered to put it on their property. And that was one option for how to go with consolidation. And the town went another route. And that was probably the biggest. Then there's the relationship with the university is extremely important. We've always tried to keep that foremost. Well, the council always tried to keep that foremost in their minds. The things that we do, they're going to impact the university. We have to talk to the university about it. The university gives us, what is it, $600,000 a year or something like that.
Yeah, it's up around 640 with the most recent budget.
They're the only campus in the university system that does it. And maybe Farmington does also. And there's a lot of pressure among the trustees of the university to not do that anymore. And that's extremely, that would be bad if we lost $500,000 in tax.
Are they under obligation, or do they,
No,
is there a contract of services they are?
We've tried to, the town historically has always tried to negotiate with them, with the university around, well, public works garage. We built a public works garage for $5 million. We tried to build one public works garage that we shared with the university. They didn't want to do that. But that was, so the university is an important regional partner. We're just not always successful in engaging.
Is there a data point of how many pilot payments are paid to the town? Like, do we know that?
I think I pulled it up earlier. It's the university at about 640, and then the Housing Foundation, which is a nonprofit affordable housing provider, also provides some level that I can find out for you.
All right, well, I guess we don't do pilot, we just pay real estate taxes. It's a nonprofit. So it's not a pilot. So yeah. So some people pay it. Right. So there's the pilot, and then there's people that are paying real estate taxes that may be able to exercise an exempt status.
Right. So yeah, so they're an exempt status and they pay a $35,000 pilot for all of their properties.
Okay.
Sort of to cover costs.
Yep.
No policy.
I think another thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about tax revenue in Orono is that Orono per capita has the lowest taxable property valuation in the state, of any community in the state. And that's primarily because of the university. And that so much of the property is not taxable. So that's always been a point of great struggle for this community, is how do you generate, then we also are required, because the university is here, to have a higher level of services than virtually any other community. So we're getting slashed from two different directions at the same time. So it's very, very important to keep your eye on taxable value in the town.
Do other municipalities like Brunswick, Bowdoin, that relationship, do they experience similar a similar relationship to your knowledge?
Well, those are private schools, so
They have to pay
I doubt very much if Bowdoin's
Okay.
paying anything to
private schools pay taxes.
very much if they're paying anything.
They're a lot smaller too. I mean, that's probably the difference. There's like 10,000 students here versus is Bowdoin a couple thousand, 1,500.
Just like also like square footage land
Yeah, small,
And-
yeah.
size too.
Because we can't just say we're not gonna send police and fire, right?
And then Brunswick, community like Brunswick has a lot more developed
Right.
properties
Yeah.
to tax that we don't have that.
You know, essentially like mall areas, which are highly taxed.
The council discussed services like, Parks and Rec, because I know there's change over time. It seemed like what Orono offered decreased. So is there discussions about regional collaboration for certain types of
Parks
services?
and Rec is one area where we've had very successful collaboration with the university, and that a lot of the after-school programming and different activities for youth are held up on the campus. And that's a nice cooperative agreement.
Didn't we do stuff with VZ at one point? And Mitch could probably answer this as well, but he's downstairs trying to.
Easy tried to have Orono provide them with police and fire services, but they wanted it at virtually no cost. They just wanted us to do it. And we couldn't go there to do that. So there's been, there's been efforts with different agencies to try and do cooperative agreement. The land trust is one that there's a lot of working with the land trust, and the land trust provides the town with a lot of vital services for the kinds of things that we're trying to do.
Yes.
It's very important that we have a good, solid, sustainable land trust organization in town.
Not in this chapter.
I mentioned that the function of Orono Economic Development Corporation.
Yeah.
You're on that? Yeah. Could you just briefly just describe what the function of that is and how it plays into the fiscal picture?
Okay, well, the OEDC, the Orono Economic Development Corporation, was put together when they built the big building that Sargent's in out on the campus. That was all part of some labyrinthian machinations that were going on at the time to make that all happen. The corporation ended up owning the building, and then when the tenant left, they were split there. So we managed the building for 10, 12 years, something like that. We finally sold the building at a great, much under the market. We took the money that we got from that, invested it, and then we started looking around for projects that we could do using those funds as a basis for those funds. And the first one that was really a big success was the Caribou Bog Outdoor Center, which is out there now. That was all made possible through the actions of the Orono Corporation. We got other projects in mind right now. Talk about them, but we got other things that we want to do as far as the Economic Development Corporation. The charter is to take actions, develop programs, do things to enhance the economic sustainability of the communities, basically. Anything from housing to retail development, commercial development of services like the Caribou Bog Outdoor Center. There's economic benefit there, and then it's going to bring hundreds of people to town, throughout the year for different purposes, but they're going to be coming to town.
Are there developers petitioning the town to build housing at all? That doesn't happen here in Orono.
Look at the way
I have the one on Grant Road. He worked with the town, didn't he? It's out Forest Avenue.
Before Taylor Road.
Yeah, go to Reed's Hill.
There's like 20 lots out there.
Well, Dennis
starting
can
to
speak to this. I mean, he's got a development on Essex.
Well, that's on Essex, yeah.
But I mean, but to have a developer come in and build 50 houses on a big lot and put them up for sale, that's not happening.
No, they're selling lots. The developers carve out all the lots on a road, build a road, carve out all the lots and sell the lots individually. And then I think each person builds their house with a builder. At least I think that's what we've seen generally. It's not like
over the years, most developers have bad experiences in Orono. They don't come back. They tell other developers not to come here. That's the bottom line.
And those bad experiences are from difficult regulations.
Regulations, ordinances, difficulties getting approvals, like the time it takes to get approvals, things like that.
Is that what happened with Black Bear Heights then? Was that part of the recipe?
It was a vernal pool issue. That they identified vernal pools, and they limited that project, if I remember correctly, it was in 2 phases. The first phase was closer to Main Street. Second phase, you had to cross vernal pools. And to make that whole project work, both phases had to be constructed. The second phase was limited because of presence of vernal pools. And so then the project wasn't feasible anymore economically.
But it's also the land use and the ordinances that make things not feasible when you have set lot sizes and density limit. Like there's lots of factors in making it run. It's not just because there was a vernal pool. like that's
Some of that's
changeable and addressable. Yeah,
Lot size has changed, hasn't it?
Yeah,
To allow-
sizes have been changed, yeah, a lot of things have got changed.
We can talk about that in just a second with existing land use, because I had identified, you know, just from since September being here and hearing from folks about what's going on, I had identified some things in existing land use, but I do want to hear if there's, you know, further things that I should be aware of. But I do have one more thing, and that's for fiscal capacity, and that's with continued long-term capital improvement planning. So for a little bit, there was a period of time, it looks like from past budgets, where there wasn't necessarily a lot of money being directed towards reserve accounts and and that's sort of how you plan for the long-term capital investments. So we know that roads have to be repaved or completely rebuilt every 10 to 30 years. We know that there are going to be, you know, trucks and vehicle needs from public safety. We know that there are going to be facility needs across the community. And so making sure that those things are maintaining the level of service that the community has expected, and also are keeping current with state and federal laws, like required upgrades to the public safety building, will be important. And making sure that we're planning for that through the capital improvement plan and putting money aside in reserves is going to be crucial in maintaining fiscal health of the community. They did do a lot of that kind of work in the most recent budget that was adopted, you know, planning for the next 5 to 10 years in terms of, you know, major investments like what I just mentioned, roads and vehicles and sidewalks and all of that. But I also want to just note that strategic investment in capital improvements can actually also provide the foundation for further private investment and growth. So for example, as we're beginning to think about land use and thinking about long-term solutions, I talked a lot about where the growth area should be and what the state requires of growth areas. And one of the things that I noted specifically in there is that there needs to be public water and sewer, that it needs to be close to EMS and fire trucks and, you know, quickly being able to get there. And so what some communities are doing that are large enough is they're looking to, you know, expand or upgrade sewer lines and water lines, or even build additional like satellite public safety buildings if the growth is such that that's needed. So in general, thinking about what we're investing in and what we actually want to see develop in the community will be important, especially over the next 10 years. Any other questions or comments with regard to the fiscal capacity section? I'll move on to existing land use. I know this is what we kind of all came for, and we have some questions that I want to get to. Just to highlight some issues that I am generally aware of. In terms of code enforcement staffing, Orono is currently the only top 20 community in Maine by population operating their department with just 1 employee. So this leads to the code enforcement department being very reactive in terms of enforcement. So instead of actually being able to drive around and understand what needs to be enforced, we are relying only really on complaints to identify code violations. And then over the past 5 years, this has been the growth in terms of permits. So the dark blue is all permits, so electrical, plumbing, building, street opening, all of the permits that are processed through that office. And then the sort of lighter blue or gray is specifically building permits. And I wanted to pull this out just because when we're talking about helping people through development review processes, being able to be proactive rather than reactive, this is really one of those big ways that we do that. Most projects are starting in the code enforcement office, even if they end up getting kicked over to me for administration through the planning board review process. They really start with our code officer. And in terms of building permits specifically, we were chatting today, and he ends up having to go through 4 at minimum inspections for every single building permit coming through the community. For plumbing, it's at least 2 inspections. For electrical, it's at least 2 inspections. And then all of the other things that he has to do. So when you start to work out how many hours that ends up being of one person, I wanted to highlight that as an issue because it ends up being very limited work week hours to respond to complaints and be proactive about answering questions that people might be sending in and things like that.
When the student housing, the larger units were being built, we had to sub out and bring in code enforcement staff, right, just to help with the load. Just couldn't manage that.
That seems like a reasonable thing to do, though, as far as being efficient.
It's cyclical.
And so I would also respond that it used to be, I mean, I was hearing this back when I started in municipal government 6-7 years ago. Like, it used to be that in the winter was sort of your slow period in code enforcement. And then in the summer it picked up because that's when everyone wanted to do that's construction season. Just from anecdotal conversation within the office and from the dates that permits are being submitted, code enforcement is ending up having to review permits basically at all times of year at this point. They don't have a slow season anymore to get as much work done as they used to be able to. So, you know, our admin assistant is wonderful, but she also staffs 3 departments, so doesn't have a lot of time to do some of the administrative tasks for code specifically.
Is council weighed in on that? Sorry.
No, go ahead.
They must be aware of this issue because we're looking at 468 building permits per year. And I mean, the building permits have jumped from, well, 87 up to 156, probably around 160. So that load must be obvious, and I'm hoping that some folks.
Yeah, so it was requested in the last budget that additional staffing for code enforcement was provided. It unfortunately didn't get through the budget process this year.
Is there anybody that does it? Is there a company that has, what couldn't a company have people to do inspections? You could call them.
I'm not aware of any.
Well, rather than having somebody on full-time staff, because then you're gonna have times when you get 2 people sitting around.
Yeah. Yeah.
People cost money. Employees are very expensive.
Right. So the other thing, of course, neighboring Old Town also has 1 code enforcement officer. He also does basically the job of 2 people in Orono because he serves as the staff person to the planning board. So going back to the regional coordination conversation, I've worked in towns that shared code officers. It's a little bit hard because you have to memorize 2 or 3 different ordinances rather than 1, but I have worked in towns that have shared in that way. So something to consider.
Is this within the scope of the comp plan to be making a recommendation on this or something? Like, I guess I'm just curious. I don't know. It seems like a council budget issue more than a comp plan.
I'm just wondering that the context, I had that same question, but the context of you framed it in development and trying to make that better.
I guess that was my point, was like when you hear whatever, I'm not gonna get into any specifics, but when you hear like, or nobody wants to do, and I know nobody's a little dramatic, but people do not want to do business in Orono, right? People don't want to develop in Orono, and then you have a bare bones sort of staff, and so, you know, to me is like, how much is our lack of investment in staff that can assist with development and or ensure that it's done right contributes to that, you know? And I think that we keep coming back to this issue of being able to, you know, create more housing, create more people in town, create, you know, and I think you have to think about the trickle down effects of what is causing that not happening. Not that we could recommend a staff, I wouldn't think.
So just to answer your question, I included this context specifically sort of to get at what you were getting at, but the state requires as part of their checklist that you provide information about staffing of the I think the wording of the question is the town's ability to staff it and enforce its land use ordinances. So this one was a specific checklist item of the state.
Yeah, because it was 420 housing units are going to be needed over the next, what was it, 10 years?
Mm-hmm.
And those, if we were able to build those, that's 420 times however many inspections. That's a lot of work.
And the concept of having a shared inspector
Yeah.
is kind of interesting with Old Town, because it seems like that's a very, you know, you have to know the rules of each, but it's not, you know, you go in, you inspect, you see, like, you know.
I know they do shared services because I do work in Old Town, so I know the code officer.
Yeah.
And he mentions coming over to help out or sub, and you know, like when Bill was here, Bill would work for other communities, and then Dave Russell was the code officer in Old Town, and he would come over here and help out. So, but then there's other code officers that they used to work multiple communities. So Milford had a part-time, but they'd work in several communities. So I think there are folks.
Yeah, Glenburn and Hudson.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I knew people that was Stonington. They worked like 4 or 5 towns. Veazey had.
Oxford does too.
So there might be a pool of people out there that perhaps could be just
It must all, I mean,
a pool of
things like plumbing and electrical must all come under BOCA.
That's what I was gonna say.
I mean, there are gonna be things about lot frontage and things, but an electrical inspector or plumbing inspector, all these towns go under the BOCA code, so.
Would be the same.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I worked in Saco, we shared our electrical inspector with another community. Yeah, so he was part-time for both, and they split the cost of his salary and benefits.
But do we know definitively if permits and things like that are the reason that people aren't developing here, or is it taxes? I mean, that's what I hear most of the time, just as a citizen, that I'm not going to start my business in Orono because the taxes are so high. It's not about permits and code and trying to get through the system. It's a lot cheaper to run a business in Veazey than it is in Orono.
I think our public engagement will kind of shine more light on this. I'll be interested to see, you know, what we're hearing from the development community, especially in the region. So to be determined, I think, is my answer right now.
What happened with the development that was under consideration at the time of the plan writing?
the 20 lot one
Yeah.
that was referenced. I wondered that too. What did the 20 lot subdivision?
Oh, the one referenced in
Yes,
here?
yes.
It hasn't been,
That's
we
right.
did
I saw that
sketch plan. We did a sketch plan review a few months ago, and they are working to submit in the next month or so.
That's the one off Main Street.
And then I also highlighted, just sort of as a known issue, I have been hearing a lot from people that there are some performance standard conflicts. So one specific article, I think that's five of the town's land use ordinance has many performance standards that have to be met by all of the land use activities that are undertaken in town. So development of a single family home up to, in a subdivision up to, you know, development of a major commercial project. And while these performance standards provide important protections, obviously, for the environment and public welfare, we have been getting the feedback that a number of these standards either aren't having the desired regulatory impact. So I've heard a lot about the town's lighting standards being too strict or not regulating, you know, dark sky compliance or not regulating environmental impacts. And then with respect to regulations around signage, I've heard a lot about conflicting with other standards of the land use ordinance. When our code enforcement officer is reviewing sign permits, it is referencing things that are no longer relevant, so haven't been updated, or just directly conflicts with some of the other review requirements in the same section. And then we did recently review a project where it was located on the Route 2 corridor, and in that area there are front setback requirements for a number of the properties in that area that can't be met because of existing main DOT easements. So we've required smaller front setbacks that frankly just can't be met because of easements that would outweigh our ordinance standards that require 60-foot setbacks. So in general, probably a wholesale review of the town's performance standards specifically should be completed just to clean up those known conflicts or areas where the performance standards even are not having the desired regulatory impact or are sort of obsolete because of other overarching legal requirements.
This is 2 meetings in a row that we, to your point, we've talked about development, and you know a lot of the history here, but if now that that's in our purview, then I think that'd be worth discussing. How do we get people to come to Orono? I mean, I work in Hamden, there's subdivisions popping up everywhere, Herman, Glenburn. And I mean, your Great Brook Heights, what year was that and how many lots are still?
2012 it was approved, there's still 4 left out there.
Still 4 left. It's Sunny Hollow. And I think finally just Shadbush Lane finally filled up with spec houses. But that's a long time between approval and actually.
Yeah, one thing, another thing that's hard for a developer is the carrying cost of that.
Yes.
And I would even suggest to the town council in a case like that they ease up on the taxes on the lot to the developer. Put the taxes up where they belong when somebody draws a permit to build a house on it. But when the guys care, that becomes very expensive carrying costs on a big lot.
Like after it's developed, but before it's sold.
No, he's saying
have one rate when it's developed and the developer still owns it.
Mm-hmm.
He draws the permit to build a spec house and raises, whoever draws the permit to build a house, have him have the taxes come up to the market value of the lot at that time. It would help the developer with the carrying costs, and that's part of his profit.
Because that's what happened with Sunny Hollow. To reduce taxes, he kept combining lots and then separating them and combining.
Oh, the one off Grant.
Yes.
Yeah.
So a good question where limitations are, you know, with planning board, how far can we go? But if staffing is part of our review and it's a known problem, we should keep that in mind moving forward.
I wonder if one strategy would be to engage like a focus group of developers and say, you know, how is it that you're choosing your towns and what could Orono do to persuade you? Just go right to, you know, the folks making those decisions in real time.
Yeah. So we are doing that in the planning department. We're having our first one later this month that I'll invite you to, because we want, like, basically in other communities that I've worked in, it was a nice way to kind of keep the lines of communication open. These are the ordinances that we're working on. What do you think of these? Is this way stricter than anything you're experiencing in other towns? Like, not that it would necessarily change what we do in Orono, but to an extent, I want to have that information as I'm writing policy to be able to say, hey, council, just so you know, this is much stricter. Here's the reasons why we're still recommending it, or here's why we're not. So that is on my list.
But to the point, the lots aren't selling. So that's why developers aren't making new lots. So, I mean, it's supply and demand. It seems simple. I'm not sure what we could do to have people buy the lots that exist today. And
goes back to her point with height, you know, perception of higher tax.
But Hamden's got high taxes too, just as high as we have here. No, the mill rates, really?
The first few years of my project, I lost sales. They'd come back to me and they say, I looked at the taxes. I can't. The tax is going to be too much. So that was
selling now, though. Like, there is more limited access to lots like that, but I think there's like barriers. Like, you'd have to really break down the process, and there's going to be barriers in everyone to figure out what those are.
Yeah. You're right. What's our mill rate here? Like 25?
23 and it's gone up to like 23.9 or something
down
like that.
significantly.
40 and it's like
yeah, but
to increase to 23.94 for the recent budget.
Well, the revaluation they're what, 28, 29.
Yeah, the mill rate dropped. So it's 24 and Hamden is 19.5.
Yeah.
So it is lower.
So they raised the value and lowered the mill rate and made more money. It's a great business.
Yeah,
As it was like 28, 29.
Yeah.
Right.
And then they
Just had to
increased
do mine.
values, but lower.
But you know, if we like pan out, and of course, my perspective is the university, we pan back and look at, you know, the attraction of, we have a lot of out-of-state students. If it was an easy thing for their parents to buy them a house when they don't want to live in the dorms anymore, they would. Do you know what I mean? If it were an easy thing for us to, we could attract more and the town could get more business and have more sales if we work together better to kind of mutually benefit from those types of things. I mean, we have housing issues, serious housing issues, and out-of-state parents in particular are not opposed to buying a house. We hear about it all the time, and we hear when the parents come in from orientation, there's nothing available, there's nothing on the market, there are no duplexes here. I'd buy my kids duplexes and, you know, we'd rent out one to pay for the other one, and, you know, we hear that kind of stuff. But we've got to look at how to be mutually beneficial. You know, we talk about the taxes at the university. The university's looking at public-private partnerships, like Hotel Ursa benefits the town for taxes, but it's on the campus. And are there other opportunities like that that can, again, mutually benefit both the town and the campus?
Restaurants on College Ave.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of, we're looking at public-private opportunities because we have buildings that are empty that can't be torn down or won't be torn down.
Yeah.
But we could put something in there that would provide tax revenue here and fill the needs of the community or the campus.
Generate tax revenue.
Healthcare.
Hotel on campus, that doesn't generate any tax revenue.
Healthcare. There's no reason. They talked about having a teaching community for some of it, but it could, if it were a partnership.
The only way you generate tax revenue in a municipality is to tax property.
Right.
It's on campus.
Well, how do the fraternity houses get taxed then? Because they're on campus and they get taxed.
They're not on campus.
Yes, they are.
They're in the university district.
No, the university owns the land and the fraternity pays the taxes.
They'll pay the taxes on the structure.
Right. But aren't there other opportunities like that?
So does then Hotel Ursa pay tax on the structure?
I don't know.
Yeah,
I would assume
if the university gives them land and they put up a fraternity house, then they're gonna pay taxes on the structure, not on the land.
Yeah, because it's a privately held hotel.
Hotel Ursa
So they're
is,
gonna have to pay
so
taxes.
there's a tax revenue from that. There's gotta be.
What I assumed
Well, I don't know.
when they said it's private.
Just university owns it.
Private university, no, it's a private hotel. We don't run the hotel.
But you own it, right?
Nope.
You lease it to them.
No,
Who owns the
They
building?
bought the property
they
and the land,
own the building. They constructed the building.
and they own the building.
We lease the property to them.
So is it like a land lease? Do
It's a
they-
land lease, yeah.
Yeah.
Typically, all of our leases are 30-year land leases, almost all of them.
That might be a loophole we have to look into.
I don't think it generates any tax revenue.
Well, fraternities, I mean, they went through the roof a few years ago when everything was reappraised and are paying $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 a piece for their, just for the crappy house.
To get back,
I hate to say that, but.
to get back to where we were previously in our discussion, the big problem with development in town is you want the development in the growth area, which is this side of the interstate and Kelly and Forest, basically. That's where you want the development. That's what we've told the state where we want the development. But how can you develop there? Look at how the roads are laid out. You can't get access to the property. Got a couple of lots that people wanted to develop on, you couldn't do it. So they're dead on the street. There's no circulation. You gotta have circulation, traffic circulation.
Well, that's why it's like the zoning and the ordinance, like that has a huge impact.
But it's a public safety issue, the dead end street point, but
I know, but
regardless, you
that
still
can
have to have
change.
circulation.
You can change that, I guess is what I'm
You
saying.
can't change that because it's a public safety issue.
Well, this came up a while ago, because
Why can't you
10 years
unget
ago,
it?
Mitch was working on a
You
project where,
can, but think about it.
where
If you have nothing but dead end streets, which is essentially all we have. Anytime you want to go somewhere, you got to come out to Main Street. There's no way to circulate other than Main Street, and it creates congestion.
the idea a few
Can't
years
you
ago with Mitch
connect?
was to have an access, a private, a public way for walking, biking that would also be accessible by public safety. that would connect all these dead end streets.
That's what.
And that seemed like a valuable way to solve this problem of public endangerment, while also increasing the livability of those areas. And then that's currently an issue that maybe we could affect.
My hope in serving on this committee is that that's part of the recommended comprehensive plan to be adopted by the council, is that the town proactively develop that circulation.
Build the road.
Build the road.
Right, yeah, that's what I'm saying, like, we can change that.
Yeah.
We've had projects that were just
Yeah.
right in, you know, in line with what we're talking about, because the Boy Scout property is gonna be a multi-use development. Because the Boy Scouts, when they were given that land,
Is or was?
Because it died on the vine apparently. So they needed to develop that land in order to, part of their agreement. Because I think they were given it by, I can't remember.
Cole.
Yeah, Cole family, thank you. So that the thought was that it might actually connect to Page Place. So there was gonna be single family housing, multi-family housing, business. There was all kinds of stuff that was gonna go in there and was gonna connect dead end streets. Black Bear Heights was gonna do the same thing, just start to have that infill development, and both projects just never went anywhere. It's unfortunate. So how do we get, you know, to your point, that's my interest too. How do we get people to come back here? Developers want to be in Orono again.
I think that was very costly for the person at the end of Page Place that owned land. He put in a very expensive bridge.
Yeah, it was undersized, but it wouldn't have met the road standards. But yeah, he had to put in a crossing, and he said for a driveway. But you know, we all knew that in theory it was going to connect that whole project. Really nice idea, just didn't go anywhere.
And the other thing you got to come to grips with is that every resident that lives on one of those dead end streets, and if you tell them you're going to connect it to another street, and they're going to jump into your shorts and tell you that you're not going to do that.
But if it's a path that's not open to public motor vehicle use, then it becomes really attractive, I think, for a lot of those homeowners.
There are ways to do.
Well, that's the way to get in. I like your thought there. You're like, oh, we're just building this public way. It's a beautiful path.
Well, think about
Yeah,
how.
no, it's good. I like it.
We don't want more traffic on Main Street, more
Yeah.
vehicle traffic, but we do want more people walking and biking and traveling to like the economic center of town from their homes that might be out there at the Boy Scout lands.
Mhm.
And it would be really attractive for a family or anyone to walk or bike on a path. People don't want to go on Main Street in that capacity. But if they could connect, and all the property owners would benefit from having this public access trail, the same way the trail that connects the university campus to Old Town benefits everyone along that way.
Would you increase housing?
Because that would, I wrote an email about this, but if the trail could be considered road frontage to then change the way building codes are permitted or property zoning codes, then it would allow developers to come in, count the trail as road frontage, and not have to build a large infrastructure of vehicle roads just for the sake of
How does the
meeting
homeowner
code.
access? Can you access the houses by vehicle?
Yeah, there would have to be very short driveways, but instead of the driveway passing the house or the road passing the house, it could be a driveway to the house only.
There are creative ways to make this happen. And
Yeah, so this is
you're expressing one creative point of view of how you could accomplish that. There's going to be others. I think the important thing is to realize is that the town has to develop the circulation path back in the growth area.
I think that
If you don't do that, it's never going to get.
The biggest problem I would see across there is the multiple landowners. You aren't dealing with 1 or 2 people.
Exactly.
You're gonna deal with 8 or 10 or 12. The guy in the middle says, no, you're done.
That's right.
There's also like models, I think there's one it's in South Portland, and there's a lot in South Carolina that are kind of those trail based, it's like the urban land use, whatever, that are not driven by cars. Like it's the development isn't like car focused, it's people focused.
Maybe like remote
tight and close
parking.
together, and yeah, you do. And so there's different ways to think about development that you could carve out an area and say, this is the approach in this one area, which is, I think it's South Portland. No, it's Scarborough.
Scarborough, we talked about.
Scarborough, yeah. And just say like, this is the concept for this piece of land or something in terms of zoning.
So I totally like what you're thinking, and we talked about the Scarborough one, which is an Elliott Chamberlain development, and I know him, and anyway, we talked about what he had to do. He was kind of ahead of the whole like smart growth thing when he came in. So now most towns have adopted some way to come forward, and he ended up having to go through subdivision, and literally it was on his 21st subdivision amendment when I worked with him, like crazy stuff to be able to get what he wanted to do. But now communities have those regulations where they do a master plan development where you set the tone and you create the zoning district. It's sort of a riff on contractor conditional zoning, which I talked about, I'll talk about a little bit more, but now there are standards for that kind of master plan development if you have a large enough lot where it's economically feasible that you can have somebody come in and propose something, or the town could create the plan and propose something.
And like I said, your comment about bringing in developers, stuff that you're already doing, that would be interesting. Something just to continue to promote. Cool.
Kind of along that same line, the 2014 plan noted a number of places where contract or conditional zoning would be allowed. I just want to kind of give some context for that because it seems like it would be maybe illegal spot zoning. So contract or conditional zoning is a tool that municipalities utilize to essentially customize the zoning for a particular parcel. So the town council would agree to rezone a property to allow more intense development of lands than what would otherwise be allowed in the underlying zoning district. And in exchange, the property owner agrees to certain limits or performance standards over and beyond what is required on those more intense uses for their project. So essentially is a contract between the town and the developer that this will be built in a certain way. There are several contract zones that currently exist, and I can show you them. You give me one moment. So like I mentioned, the 2014 plan recommended a number of contract zoning areas. It was this one here on, sort of in between summer and spring, the Buyer Mill project to create, I think it was 30 housing units when it was all said and done. And then Ayers Island in 2014 was another place that would be sort of right before this kind of contract zoning, just because it is a brownfield site. There's some weird issues with access, and it was previously more industrial use. And then, and then there was also in the 2014 plan, I think it's, this property here off of Main Street, which is the one where that 20 lot subdivision that I referenced in the chapter is being proposed, more on this side of the property. But he has a lot of property left after that, and it was previously like gravel pits and his construction headquarters, so sort of a unique use as well. The rest of these in the orange on this map were approved prior to the 2014 plan.
Yeah, Tyler Tech, your site, right? Wasn't that a contract zone?
Yeah.
A focal area from our last comprehensive plan that was in the list. Buyer, University Motor Insight. There's several that are now being developed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's this has been something that's been used throughout Orono. Okay, it's not really showing up well anymore, but it's all of these orange sites on the map. So this could also be a tool for further development of certain sites. And I do want to note for this one specifically, the council had asked in regards to the old public works facility site for something to be considered there around making it ripe for housing development. They were interested in pursuing that for that site. So I would say that it is likely that a recommendation of this plan is probably going to be that that site is ripe for some sort of contract or conditional zone that a developer would propose to the town. And obviously continuing to judiciously employ this tool, especially for those sort of unique parcels that were home to more industrial type uses or high intensity uses with limited redevelopment potential otherwise would be important.
What are the issues with contract zones? Because I remember one of your predecessors in planning here at the town was, he said you only want to use that in certain instances. What is your opinion on contract zones?
So I have had in the first town I ever worked in some pretty difficult experiences with contract zones. I tend to be of the same opinion that it's a judicious tool for certain specific sites, but should not be utilized for like every site in town. The town should be doing its own work up front to zone sites appropriately to allow for the kind of development that it wants to see. So if you're getting too many contract zoned applications, it's probably an indication that your zoning is not matching up with the development that would be economical for developers or that the community wants to see.
Or you're not getting the applications at all though, right? Which is what like is happening.
Contract zone already wards people away, the type of zoning that's there. Is that what you're saying?
Well, you're saying
So there's
if
no
you're
application.
getting applications for contract zones, but I think we're saying like, we're not getting the applications we want, period, which could be another indication that the zoning is not like done well to encourage the type of development that we want.
Just a couple success stories because Buyer is being redeveloped.
But wasn't that a contract zone?
Yeah, that was just
Yeah.
within the past year or so that
Yeah.
that one was adopted.
But identified in 2014, and there's been some projects in areas that we targeted. So I think that's a success.
I think she's saying that the zoning outside of the contract zone is not aggressive enough.
Conducive,
Okay.
yeah, and
Yeah.
obviously not conducive to the type of development that we need and want.
I want to share something else just because it's kind of organically coming up in conversation. So I in your packet had put together this map. So what you're seeing here is just the zoning districts, and the yellow areas that you're seeing are the medium density residential zoning districts, which typically only allow for the development of single family homes. LD 2003 shifted that a little bit, but you're still fairly limited in what you can develop on those lots. Now, the map that is coming up here is our parcel map, and anywhere in the yellow that you're seeing this sort of reddish orange is a multifamily unit. So it would be a grandfathered non-conforming property in the MDR zoning district under our current regulations. This was something that was identified back in the 2014 plan. It was touched on at least. There weren't specific policy recommendations, but I did want to just point this out because I think to your point, this is, if you're having so many non-conforming lots, it's sort of an indication that potentially this zoning doesn't match up with what's underlying. Well, actually this directly shows that that's the case, but so yeah, anywhere that you're seeing this sort of reddish orange color, so a lot over on this side, a lot over around Mill Street, and off that way is multifamily dwellings that are actually not technically allowed in that zoning district. So if you're going to be trying to add units, you wouldn't be allowed to do that here.
You said you would not be allowed to add units in anything that's yellow? So I'm sorry, I was looking at the map.
To some extent, yeah. So the yellow area that you're seeing was historically a single family zoning district. Although I might argue that that was what it was through regulation, but not actually what it historically was, as this is sort of showing us because we have so many non-conforming lots. Until the adoption of ordinances as a result of the state's recent legislation on housing, LD 2003, which the town adopted back in December of last year, you would not have been allowed to build anything other than single family homes in this district. Now, in certain instances, you can build a duplex in this district, or like separate condoized units, but still not multifamily like apartment buildings as we would traditionally understand them, which is the more economical option in most cases.
And even the duplexes in MDR need 20,000 square feet. Is it half an acre?
It's 15,000 square feet now, so
15,000?
like a third of an acre.
Third of an acre.
Yeah. Per unit.
Yeah. Unless you do a high density. But you could do an MDR, right? You can do a PUG or whatever we call it.
That comes under a different set of regs.
Right, but you can do that.
Planned unit development.
Yeah,
that's its own set of regs.
Yeah, so
cluster development. You can
cluster development allows for additional
Density
density.
bonus.
Yeah, but you have to set aside a certain amount of space as open space, and typically that open space has to have some sort of like natural resource component that is being preserved.
Which requires a good amount of land, like which takes away the density.
Well, meaning you
When
get a
you're
higher
in
density, but you
town.
can't do it on a 2-acre lot. It's gotta be
Right.
like a 20-acre lot
Right.
or something like that.
So back in, I think 2016 or 2017, it used to be that it was a minimum of 7 acres for cluster development. They changed it to a minimum of 3 acres, but to your point, if you have to set aside about a third of that for natural resource protection or open space, doesn't leave you a whole lot of land to take advantage of the density bonuses.
You said they, that's the state, that state.
No, like the town.
Oh, the town.
Yeah.
I'm confused now.
Mhm.
There's planned unit development, which can occur in MDR. Now, and then there's, I think what we call conservation cluster development in the F&A district. That's where you got to set aside green space for productive uses and that sort of thing.
The cluster development is available in essentially any of the zoning districts where residential is allowed. So the conservation cluster, and it's a minimum of 3 acres.
And so what are the rules around the PUD, planned unit development? And is that different now, or did they incorporate that into the cluster? No.
I might have to get back to you with a smarter answer on this.
This is my bad. I said just down this path. It's a useless path.
I am quite sure that it was sort of all incorporated it together under cluster development, but I will research and get back to you.
There are mechanisms though to do a higher density.
The downside of the cluster is the percentage of the land that you have to leave in green space. I mean, so no help because it encumbers your land.
I'd have to, it's been a long time since I looked at the regs on all this stuff, so I don't know if that's necessarily the conclusion.
My understanding, each zone requires a different percentage.
Yeah.
There's a percentage of a cluster that if you're in this zone, you could have this percentage.
Fair Heights was going to be a cluster development. I don't recall there being a big set aside of open space.
They
like 40
did have a
acres
fairly
though, right?
significant open space set aside.
It's gotta be a bigger site.
Yeah.
Well, the vernal pool, that was a whole different set. I've got to go, so excuse me.
Set aside the vernal pool.
Yeah.
That's what they're trying to do with the pyramid.
With the polygons.
So are we to look at the town and the lots and the zoning and identify those areas like that were in orange in 2014 of what should be those contract zones or what? When do we get to that?
So I think in terms, so what I had just showed on the map, just for clarity, is our existing today lots that would be non-conforming under today's existing regulations. So the orangey ones are currently non-conforming out there. To answer your question, we will need to understand what kinds of development the community wants through phase 2, which is where we get into pretty intensive public engagement. And then in phase 3, which is more policy making, we'll really synthesize the conversations we've had here, the issues and opportunities that we've defined here, and then also what the community wants to understand. So if we're overwhelmingly hearing, yes, our goals are increasing housing production, then I think we could make the logical conclusion that amending some zoning districts is probably the way to achieve that partially.
But you did also show us the prior map of orange from 2014 that were identified as contract zones in the comp plan, right?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Okay.
And I think when we get to phase 3 policymaking, we will need to kind of most likely suggest some areas that would be right for contract zoning too.
Okay.
Along this sort of same vein, I had identified, well, actually, the inquiries that our department is increasingly getting, so from my desk, from Mitch's desk, and from our code enforcement officer's desk, is some people wanting to do some interesting new business ideas or some new market niches, try to fit more in the green economy. And our existing regulations and land use definitions were adopted in 1992. And while the schedule of allowed uses has sort of been updated since, it really is lacking in a lot of ways. So if something is not allowed in the schedule of uses or not written there, it is technically not allowed. So as we're getting these inquiries, we're unfortunately having to turn people away because their business use would just simply not be allowed under our existing ordinances. We don't have anything that it fits in well under.
You get an
So
example of
I know, and are people not then offered to go to town council to revise the ordinance? Like, is that?
So to some extent, the response would be, yes, you can go through a process of amending ordinances. But if I'm a smaller business looking to locate like in an existing building, and I've never been through that process before, that can be very prohibitive because they sort of want to be able to rent a space immediately and get in there immediately, and it's not super helpful to them, unfortunately.
Changing an ordinance, that takes a long time.
It's a couple of months process.
Well, I know, but like, it just seems like you would jump on that as a town.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you still have to line up everybody, because planning board has to see the change. It's just
No, I know.
line
Yeah.
up people in
It's
all the
a
meetings.
multi-step process, but.
But what are the examples, to her point, like what were some of the examples that we?
Yes.
So we had one that was sort of interested in being essentially like a storage space for.
You don't want that in Orono.
It was sort of, and then like battery storage is a big one that's going on in other communities as
Yeah.
sort of a response to.
Battery storage?
Yeah.
We worked on a project up in East Millinocket, redevelopment of the mill site. It was just tractor trailer units, well, modified for battery storage. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Like mega batteries or like?
What's that?
what are they being stored for?
Solar,
What?
solar and hydro.
Solar, and there's a lot of information technology up your alley, but yeah, they had, it was 20, 30 of them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a pretty big one right now. You know, that would be one that we would have to consider. And then the other thing is just generally many instances where in other communities, land uses that would be generally acceptable just aren't defined or are too tightly defined to actually be utilized. So there's a variety of things that are either completely omitted from the ordinance or are just sort of prohibitive to folks. One of the ones that was identified in the 2014 plan that has since been changed was like bed and breakfast uses. So that was way too tightly defined back in 2014, and they expanded that a little bit to be easier for folks.
So how does one go about, is there like some analysis of that somewhere where that you can, I mean, because we could be like, okay, battery storage, that sounds good. Bed and breakfast, that sounds good. Is there like a model or something?
There's something called I'm not going to get the acronym right, but it's like a NAICS code, and that updates with land uses that are being proposed as sort of new things. And many municipalities just reference that like code number and say, if you're defined under this, you are allowed here, and these are the places where you're allowed. And that one's more frequently updated by some federal government source, I think.
Is that the industry code thing?
Yes.
Or is that, oh, it is?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that one, you know, is at least more frequently updated.
Yeah, every 5 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, that seems very limiting if it's like let's think of the industries, and you'd have to update it way more than every 10 years.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the best thing that you could do in most cases is to be
Yeah.
broad enough to get the businesses that you're looking for and just tight enough to be able to kind of weed out the things that you don't. I mean, and that's not like a great answer, but that's sort of the art of the whole thing. And then going back to our previous conversation around like road frontage requirements. So there is an interesting thing in our ordinance that there are dimensional requirements for each zone, and they require each lot currently to have frontage along a public or a private road. There is an allowance for private roads approved by the planning board, but there are no specific requirements or any road standards for private roads if I'm just trying to do, for example, one back lot behind my property. So essentially a long or widened driveway for a rear parcel to utilize. Even if I have the minimum lot area, the frontage would be a limiting factor there. So what many communities are doing, especially in the zoning districts that are a little bit outside of like the growth area, they are allowing back lot provisions or standards for private roads where it's just 1 or 2 additional houses and not something that would actually trigger subdivision review, in order to essentially provide owners with flexibility in the use of their land and an incremental way to increase the developable land within the community.
Why would we not want that in the growth region?
For the most part, because the lots are too small. It wouldn't be that we wouldn't want it. I think we would, but it would be that the lots in general wouldn't allow for the number of units unless we changed our ordinances.
But I mean, to the point, like of the increasing the amount of people living in the growth zone, would we want to look at changing those ordinances? In it for lots that meet a set size, 15,000 square feet or whatever.
So I guess I'll show my bias a little bit. My argument would be that instead of doing this sort of backlot provision, we would just allow multifamily units. So you didn't have to build any sort of road that meets any sort of standard. You could just have multiple units on your property. But as sort of an incremental way, this could be an initial step to do that. So where I live, there are sort of properties along the road, but then there are these long driveways that serve 3 or 4 lots, 2 or 3 lots, so it doesn't trigger subdivision, sort of on these driveways.
Multifamily though is one building that's extended.
Yeah.
And that's I would think that would be detractive for a lot of people that might want to do something with a larger lot that they might own. Where having an extra house with a separate driveway would be advantageous.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's kind of what we're going to have to understand from folks is like, what is the community comfortable with? So for example, if I'm in the MDR, am I comfortable with a multi-unit building that looks like a single family home, like some of these historic houses? Am I comfortable with, splitting lots for additional single family homes? I think that's going to be a lot of what we figure out in phase 2 is what folks are comfortable with.
And is it people's comfort by what they're looking at? Is like what does it matter?
I can tell you that when I was working on this the last time, the people in Outer Forest, Essex Street area, it was a requirement of 5 acres that property had to stay in 5-acre lots. And that's why you had a lot of these long, skinny lots, long driveways in. They absolutely did not want that changed. They like the trees, they like the privacy, they like the space for the animals to go back and forth. So I think that was something.
Because if somebody could develop along and build lots on their
And I lived on Westwood. I absolutely didn't want that development between Spencer and Westwood.
No.
Because I could see the woods from my back window, not houses. So
everyone should be prepared that nobody wants any change.
Right.
Like we talk about change here, but if we put like a road behind that thing, they'll be here with pitchforks. And I'm on the planning board. I've been in front of a lot of
Bruce. Black Bear Heights.
Huh?
We approved Black Bear Heights. There was a lot of pushback. But
Yeah, but it was, they meant that when you meet people don't realize that, you know, when you meet the ordinance, you meet the ordinance. That's,
Right.
we're not deciding what we don't like and don't
This
like.
would be helpful to show success stories for some alternative approaches when we get to the public input
Yeah.
phase, just to have a lot of good examples, just so people can visualize what we're talking about rather than.
But this
70s.
change, you could see neighborhoods getting upset where, like, imagine at Page Place, all of a sudden they're big enough. And you've got now all these extra driveways throughout that neighborhood with houses behind it, abutting now the neighborhood behind it. So now, as you said, I look out my window and now I'm like, oh, what's this house here? And now you're in that neighborhood, you live in that neighborhood, and there's all these extra driveways, all this extra traffic. And you're like, what's all this? Like, we have people upset when someone wants to open up like a home occupancy, where there's gonna be a couple visits a day, and the neighborhood is up in arms about it. And now there's gonna be 3 car trips a day here in my neighborhood.
It's the only way to have growth, though. So it sounds like we just need to prepare people that this is, if we expect Orono to grow and thrive, this has to be allowed. And so telling the story in a way that's gonna give people a positive feeling is gonna be really important.
And it's not just about growing, and I think your story about the schools was so compelling last meeting. Like, it's about surviving.
It's about sustaining what we have, right?
Yeah.
If we talk about raising class sizes at ASA from 17 to 25, people are gonna be up in arms. If we talk about eliminating world language from K to 8, they're gonna be up in arms. And those are all things that are at stake.
Yeah, they want everything. Agreed.
But we need more tax
We
base.
need to frame it.
Yeah.
So we need, I don't like the options are to tax more the people that are currently here or increase the tax base by growing. Is
But
there another way?
for schools, it's more than increasing taxes because we rely on funding that is dependent upon the number of students we have in the building. And so our funding rises and falls with the number of students in the building. And that's why housing is such an important conversation for the schools.
Mhm.
Because we have people who want to be here who can't because there's nowhere for them to live. And we have people in their mind settling for schools in surrounding towns. We have people paying for their kids to go to private schools because they can't get their kids in this district. And at least in terms of the school funding situation, if we could provide a home for all the families who want to live in Orono, our school funding conversation would be completely different than the one that we're facing right now.
That supports everything I'm saying too.
Yeah.
Like we want more like single family homes in Orono.
But I think your point about showing what it could be, for example, I mean, all I could see when I lived on Westwood was that I was going to look out my back door and I wasn't going to see trees. If I knew that there was going to be a separation of trees between me and the complex, that would have been a different story. But that wasn't the story that was being told, you know? So like that, those are the things that we have to be looking at. We have to sell it.
Yeah, I mean, you two should get together. You make a plan. I'm on board.
And I think just to respond to your question, I don't know what people are comfortable with, but to me, and in my experience, people do tend to be more comfortable with, does it look like a single family home, regardless of how many people are actually living in it. So it kind of comes down to like the design and architectural character rather than how many people are living in it.
But doesn't Orono have that, more than 4 people that aren't related can't, I mean, there's also that, they don't want unrelated people living together.
They didn't want students, that was
students,
Yeah.
but you know,
One
I
of the
mean,
bigger things that people would be wanting today would be in-law apartments. That would free up some of the housing zones if somebody could add on to their house.
So with the adoption of the standards to comply with the state legislation on LD 2003, accessory dwelling units or in-law apartments are now allowed anywhere that a single family home is allowed. So you are allowed by right to come to the code enforcement officer and get a permit for that now, as of December of last year.
But they have to be connected, right?
The occupant has to be related.
It has to be a single home.
No, they can
Expanded.
be like above a garage or in a backyard, it doesn't have to be connected anymore.
So then the requirement is that it has to share a single driveway? What is, like, so how does that get around, how does that, what if I wanted to make my parents a home in the back and you needed a driveway? Would that
So
be-
you would have to demonstrate that you can meet parking requirements, which has also been shortened to, I think, just 2 now, for the single family home and the ADU. And to your point, one of them has to be owner occupied.
So actually, can we talk about parking requirements?
Yeah.
This is a big thing in,
ADUs didn't add to the parking requirements, actually.
Yeah, it's 2 just for the single family home. Sorry,
Yeah.
I misspoke. So you don't even
That needs
need
to be
parking
changed.
requirements
yeah,
anymore.
so why do we have it as 2? Do you know the history? Like, why is 2 the number? Why not 1?
That is a great question that I don't know the answer to. So I will say, like, parking standards in communities tend to be controversial because people don't tend to want people parking on the street. So now in today's world, unfortunately, the reality is that most people have 2 or more cars. And so I think that was I don't know the history, but I think that was sort of the thought process behind that requirement. And it has been lowered recently. It was more.
But
So
you can
always
add an
go-
ADU attached or not, and it doesn't change the parking requirement for your property.
Oh, I just think like there are a lot of urban areas that are reducing the parking requirements. And because they're sort of silly as it is, like you end up with just giant parking lots and big roads and big driveways and a lot of paved areas. A lot of that paved area is public space, but it's not really livable space. And if it's hurting the proposition for a developer to come into Orono because they need 2 parking spaces for each dwelling, if it were just 1 and there was space on the street to park or in a remote little parking lot for those people that might be visiting, that might be something that can that be part of the scope that we might talk about within the?
That is most definitely part of the scope. Yeah.
I have
I think remote overnight parking
don't
is
even have
also an issue.
Foreign
Yeah.
students don't have vehicles.
I think that's the direction this
Like,
culture is
for
moving.
example, in this lot down here, I'm probably not allowed to park there overnight.
You're not, or here, right? Or are you here?
I don't think so.
No, so
you're not.
like in our family, we have a tiny driveway and a lot of children. So when they're all home in the winter, we park my work, but I have my work to park at. But there is no overnight parking that I know of that's
No,
available.
it's a huge problem on campus too, because it contributes to drunk driving.
Mhm.
You know, if I know that it's cold out and I can drive my car there, and I'll roll the dice to drive home.
As opposed to getting towed.
As opposed to, I know my car is gonna get towed versus I may or may not get a ticket.
I think it's 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. It's no parking.
Right.
So to your point,
Challenge.
in a lot of urbanized areas, for example, like this area outside the window, they would account municipal parking lots that you could park overnight in as counting towards the parking minimum that would otherwise be required. So you can kind of get around it that way of, okay, well, there is consistently 15 spaces available in this lot, so that will count towards reducing my minimum requirements by 15 spaces. Frankly, there is an argument to be made that if you're living in this sort of downtown walkable area where you can get a lot of your daily amenities, you probably don't need a car anyway, or you might share with somebody that you live with. I think that this will definitely be part of the conversation. And again, it'll be kind of understanding what level we need to require and readdressing that section.
To Eric's point, when would parking and some other issues, what meetings would that be?
I think we would need to talk about that after we hear from the public about what their goals are. So I mean, I think that we're going to end up hearing that environment and housing and business development are all important issues. And so, environment, that touches on all of it. So once we get into sort of the policy making phase of this whole thing is when we could talk about that thing. That's all I have with existing land use. This might be a good opportunity to talk about any other issues or opportunities that you see or are aware of. With the 13 minutes we have left. Or if you have questions, I'm happy to answer that as well.
Can you explain tax increment financing and those kinds of types of things? Just, what TIFs there are existing in town?
Yes, so in the first packet that I sent out where we discussed the economy section, I included an appendix with the tips that are currently in the community. Tax increment financing, just broadly, is essentially a way to shelter increases in revenue for certain designated projects. So if you are and it can only be for commercial or multifamily projects. So if you're aware of a project that is about to come into your community, you might work with the Economic Development Office to create a TIF for that project. The TIF would shelter up to 100% of the increase in assessed value. So the building cost, if it's a brand new building taxation, for up to 30 years. And then you can utilize that revenue that is captured for a variety of capital improvement projects, paying for certain staff members who do work with generally related to economic development, even the cost of like a prorated cost of a fire truck or a police cruiser or things like that. It also lowers the amount that is considered as part of our county taxation formula. So it kind of removes that from our overall taxable value of the community and removes money from other state fiscal formulas. So I might have a graphic that kind of shows this if you will indulge me. And there are a variety of TIFs in Orono that cover, some that cover just one parcel and some that cover many parcels that are related to economic development projects. And you can also use them in affordable housing development. The other thing that I will add is that sometimes it can be a way to get developers here who might otherwise not come here, because it might give them sort of, well, they call it a credit enhancement agreement, but some initial money back from their property taxes, or essentially a discount on their property taxes that can be used to finance other improvements or actually make the financing work for a project. This is for another town. So the numbers are slightly off here. It would be more like 50-50 in Orono, but this kind of gives you a breakdown. So typically about 50% of every dollar of revenue in Orono is going towards state and county government, state aid to education, our county taxes, and then about 50% in Orono is staying in the community. Now TIFs would end up capturing the whole dollar, so it's not captured in those state and county government fiscal formulas. And then that money can be utilized for all of the projects that I just mentioned.
Have you been advocating for more TIFs in your other communities? I
do a lot of TIF work in other communities, and it, especially in rural communities where a significant portion is going towards state and county fiscal formulas, it ends up being a good route for them.
Yeah, so that's a topic of discussion with developers, if that makes projects more appealing. Yeah.
And, you know, it can be something that ends up making the financing work, like the make or break of actually developing in a town.
What questions? On tap next time.
So next time we have recreation, transportation, and public facilities generally. So chat through some facilities and some roads and some active transportation and some recreation programming.
Can we have a guest speaker, maybe public works director? He's pretty new.
He's very new, but I was hoping to get our recreation director in to chat through some of her stuff.
When is that meeting?
Our next meeting is on the 31st of this month, so a little bit closer than last time.
It's July 31st.
No, we had to kind of speed it up because of when my contract was adopted.
Okay. So the meeting July 31st and when's the next?
It would be July 31st and
Can we do August 7th?
I think we did August 7th.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
I had that on my calendar. Okay.
Bang, bang.
Yeah. Bang, bang.
Oh, I'm away August 7th. Maybe,
Does it
Join via Zoom.
have we had members zoom in? Does that work reasonably well?
I'm gonna be away August 7th and I'll be zooming in.
Yeah, I'm just wondering about the
Zooming in
audio.
tonight.
Does it pick up
It
well?
picks up, our minute taker utilizes the video to take the minutes and she said it worked fine,
Okay.
so.
And we shouldn't go 2 weeks in a row then. Two close together.
I guess we should open up the public comment period number 2. I'm assuming nobody else is listening or
Nobody
has
online.
questions. Get out a few minutes
It's
early.
getting more exciting, get some people online.
Yeah, I know it, man.
You know what, they knew what we were saying.
That's true.
Big discussion. We'll see you all in July, end of July. Thanks, everybody.